Everyone is to make VTuber models, but don't even know where to start? Let's go over how to get your art ready for rigging. Hey, it's Ray, and today we're going to be going over how to get your art from a 2D image into ready to rig in Live2D. So to start, I'm going to be going over how I separated this art. Here, this PSD will be available for free on my Ko-fi if you would like to look at it more. But basically, we're just going to go over some small general tips because every model is going to be different and the needs of every model are going to be different. So some good general rules of thumb are separating things between the left and the right. So if I go to like the eyes, for example, I have a left and a right. And the reason I have that is because then as you move the head to look left or right, you can deform or like warp the shapes at different rates so that they kind of create that illusion of depth. My eyes are actually split out quite a bit, and you could wonder, why are you doing that? And it's because I want to handle all of the movements for these differently. I want to make sure that I can handle the shape changes for all of these different pieces separately. So I want to make sure that if I put the eyelid like this eyelid line with the eyeliner line and the eyelid skin, that would maybe be simpler, but it would be a little bit harder to control the fine-tune shapes that the eyelid makes. And I really want to make sure that this line looks nice as I'm deforming it, so I went ahead and split it out. You don't have to do that. You can do whatever feels comfortable or best for you. If you have the free version of Live2D, you may need to combine more things because you have less stuff to work with, but we can go over that in another video sometime. But generally speaking, separating things from left to right, if you have a piece that goes across and is connected, you want to keep it connected. If you have two pieces that you want to make sure never separate, ever, at all, you'll probably want to make sure that you combine those. So like, for example, my bangs on this model are line art and color combined together. Most of the time, you'll probably want to combine your line art with your art layer, because as you change the shape of them, the line art could pull away from the color and create gaps, and you usually don't want that. But if you want to have effects with like shadows, so on the face here, I have this face shadow. Because I don't want this face shadow to go over the line, because you can have it, overlap like that. I have the line on top of the face shadow, which is clipped onto the head base color. So they're separated for that reason. You can also create some other cool effects by doing that. So basically it just has to do with how do you want things to move? And if you aren't sure, that is okay. You can change your art in Live2D as you're going, so you don't have to worry about, oh, I did it wrong the first time, I need to start all over. You can actually import updated versions of your art file as you go. You may have to re-rig some parts, but you don't have to start completely from scratch. Some important things to keep in mind, though, is in Live2D, the only kinds of like rendering settings, which are like these drop-downs for layers that you might have in your art program. This is Clip Studio Paint, so this is what it looks like for me. The only ones that Live2D supports is multiply and add. If you want to do like color burn or hard light, they won't be supported in Live2D at present in the current version. This is version 5.0 that I'm talking about. And another thing to keep in mind is that anything that you're clipping down, you'll want to make sure that you kind of like have an obvious way that it clips, because you will have to re-clip everything once we get into Live2D, and we can actually go ahead and jump into that. But basically the rule of thumb for separating your art is if you want it to move together, merge it together. And if you want it to have separate movements or separate arcs, separate art. I thought that sounded cute. All right, let's go ahead and jump into Live2D. All right, so now we're in Live2D. I'm going to go ahead and import the Photoshop document file. So there's two different ways you can do this. You can drag the Photoshop file just into the Live2D UI, or you can go to File, Open, select your Photoshop file, and hit Open. So once we get in here, you'll see that all the clipping is gone, just like I said it would be. But how do we get it back? So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the process. So let's go ahead and just do the shadow since I showed it earlier. So you see that it has a clipping ID field right here in the Inspector tab. Your layout may look a little bit different than mine. All of the tabs are movable, and this is just a layout I like. But you'll want to look for the Inspector tab, and you'll see this clipping ID field. So what we need is we need to find the piece that we want it to clip to. So in our case, that's going to be the head main color. I'm going to copy the ID from this, which is the identifier for this art layer. You're going to paste it into the clipping ID field of the one that you want to clip to it, and you will see the clipping take. So basically the way that it works is you go to the layer that you want to clip something to, grab its ID, and paste that ID into the respective layer. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that for all of these layers. We're gonna just time-lapse that real fast. You may notice that in some of these, I'm doing multiple IDs. That means that the layer can clip to multiple layers at once. It'll do the biggest area, so keep that in mind. You can also go ahead and clip multiple things at once, so I'm going to go ahead and grab this back of mouth too, because I have two different mouths, the kitty mouth and the standard mouth shape. We grab the back of mouth too. As you can see here, the name is different than the ID. We're going to grab all the things that I want to be clipped to the back of the mouth to basically simulate like the cover of the skin. Go ahead and paste that, and there you go. They're all clipped onto that. One thing you may have noticed if you were going through and adding that there's this invert mask checkmark. And you'll also notice that these pieces kind of just extend past the shape, and I've named them cutout. What does that mean? So there's two different ways that clipping can work in Live2D, the standard way and basically a way that does like an alpha mask or a masking layer that you might see like the inverse of a clipping mask, essentially. So we're going to grab the IDs of these two pieces, and we're going to go to the bell main and name them as clipping layers. Now, you'll notice at first that this makes basically the whole bell go away, which is maybe not what we want. But then if we invert the mask, wow, that doesn't look any different. But if we lower the opacity on this cutout, you'll see that it actually cuts through the bell main, so you can see the little ball on the inside. But we can't really tell what's going on with this line, so let's go to the main, because I just copied top twice. Line, there we go. And now we can kind of see that it's there, but the shadow isn't really working. So as I mentioned before, Live2D supports multiply and add. So we're gonna go ahead and change the blend mode to multiply. And there you can kind of see it going in. We're gonna go ahead and move the inner bell just so that you can kind of see what's going on. There's all of our clipping done. So now you're like, okay, I have the art in here, now what? So the way that Live2D generally works for doing the distortion of your art to create those different shapes and that illusion of depth is through something called the art mesh. Now there are two ways that you can go about creating art mesh. If you notice when I highlight everything has these just boxes around it. This is the default art mesh for your art. Basically, for any piece of your art, it just has this plain old box around it, and you can squash and stretch these points, and it'll try and move your art relative to those shapes. But for a lot of shapes, that box is not going to be enough for probably most, if not all of them. So we can go ahead and select everything, and there's two ways to create mesh for art. Auto meshing, which is this button that has this little triangle and says auto, and this manual meshing, which has this triangle and a pen. We're gonna go through auto meshing first. So you'll click on auto mesh, you'll see standard, deformation little, and deformation heavy. Standard is kind of just the default. It does everything like a decent amount. It's not super detailed, but it gives you a lot more detail than just that box before, obviously. This is good for basically just the default. If you're not sure, standard's pretty good. For heavy, you'll get a much greater area of detail. You can see that like the area that it pulls is much smaller and can create rounder shapes. But the more points that you have, the more power your computer will need to run the model. So that's important to keep in mind. If you basically mesh everything like this, your computer will lag, both in Live2D and in your VTuber model, unless you have a super beefy machine. But generally, I wouldn't recommend doing this for everything. This is great for things that you need to move a lot, like say, if you're going to have something sway with intense physics, deformation heavy could be good for that. If you don't want to see basically the edges of that show up, deformation heavy will reduce the chances of that. You could also just manually draw the mesh yourself if you want something super high detailed, and we'll go over that in just a moment. And then the last one is deformation little, which is the least detailed. This is the easiest on your computer to process, but also going to be the most likely where you'll see these kind of bumpy edges that you're seeing pop up here. So for most things, deformation standard is fine. If you're like, oh, I'm not really gonna change the shape of that too much, maybe I'm just going to move it around. So like for me, the tongue is kind of just gonna move up and down, left and right. I'm not gonna change its shape too much. I could maybe get away with a deformation little, which for the tongue, it's also a small piece, so that's not too different. You can also change these as you go. You may have to do a little re-rigging if you were doing anything on the mesh itself, which I don't generally recommend, but you can update it as you go. If you're like, oh, I didn't actually move it that much, I'm going to reduce the amount of points I have in my mesh. So now let's go over manual meshing. So for some things that I manually mesh are the things that I want to deform the most, things that are most important to get the shapes right. Things like the lips, for me, the eyelids, and sometimes the eyebrows. I just want to make sure that they look good because they're going to be the most eye-catching parts of your model, no pun intended. So let's go over auto meshing. So for this upper lip, we're going to go ahead and go to the auto meshing tool, and this is the manual meshing tool. And this is what we had automatically generated. And you can see here, if I go back out and I like pull these points, this is not moving the way that I would want it to. So the way that a lot of people do a mouth is that they'll draw a path along the shape of their mouth, and then, you know, move the path to create mouth shapes. But what this does under the covers is it just moves the points that are in your mesh. So if your mesh isn't detailed enough, or like isn't lined up correctly with your art, you'll see these like jagged edges and shapes that don't move the way that you would want them to. You just kind of don't have enough fine detail in there to really grab those shapes that you're looking for. So we're going to go ahead and redo this mesh. You'll also notice this will get rid of our path, and that's okay. We can just make it again. That is fine. So you'll notice I don't see my tools. So when you go to the auto mesh, you'll want to go to the tool details tab. I usually have it hidden by default because I only need it when using specific tools, but that's where the tools for manual meshing are going to live. So you'll see this arrow. This is just like a selector. You'll see lasso, similar deal. Add point, remove point, delete area, and then this is like adding detail. So I'll go over an example. So let's say I drew a box. Cool. You'll see all these blue lines. That means that if you hit auto connect, it'll create those. So what this button does is it adds it subdivides this piece. You can also hit 4 division to just generally subdivide. Generally speaking, that's how these tools work. And then this tool is really handy for things like the face shape. I'm going to use it for the bottom lip, so we're going to get to that in a second. And then of course you can go ahead and auto mesh something from this little auto button within the manual mesh editor. We're just going to go ahead and start from scratch. And this piece is symmetrical, but I'm probably not going to draw the mesh perfectly symmetrical if I just do it by hand. So one handy little tool is mirror edit. If you click mirror edit, you'll see this green line show up, and it may not be perfectly aligned with where you need. You can change the axis position with this. I usually just drag until it looks good. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. It's a symmetry ruler for your mesh editing. So now you can go ahead and draw a shape. Bam. Okay, so what do these shapes mean? So for the lip, I usually try to have the lines follow the lip shape itself, and then I have this area outside be generally close, but have to try and make it as even as I can across the edges. And you'll see these little sub triangles pop up. You'll also see mesh opened while you're in the process of working. That is okay. You'll also notice that I'm putting the points between the other points. That creates these really nice shaped triangles. You can see these triangles. That gives your mesh a lot of room to work with. So I go ahead and I'll hit auto connect, and then we have this nice little mesh. You could say this is maybe still not super detailed for a mouth, and so I can go ahead and hit, that's super detailed. Maybe we don't need that much, but you can go ahead and you know, have it at whatever level of detail you want. I'm also going to get rid of these. I don't like these middle lines, so I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of them. And I'm going to do a lasso tool. Merge. I'm actually going to just get rid of these points because I don't need them. So I can just go ahead and cross this bridge. So I'm going to turn off mirror edit, and I'm going to select each point, and then that'll let me connect these points together. There we go. We've meshed our lip. We even got to keep our path. I'm going to go ahead and erase this path. And actually point erase. So these work very similarly to the mesh edit tools that we were just using. I like to follow the general shape as closely as I can. That'll give me the best results. And while you're in the path edit tool, you can still also add points in the middle. So I'm like, okay, I think I need one more point of articulation here, but I want to make sure to, there we go. And now you'll see that this is a lot closer to the shape than we had before. So like when I squirt it, you might still see these sharp edges, and that might be where you want to add more points, but this is just as an example of how to use these tools. So now we're gonna do it one more time on the bottom lip. I'm gonna erase all these. I don't like them. We're gonna show you this path tool. You can also mirror edit. And I draw a path very similarly to how I did before for the actual lip. And you're like, Ray, that looks awful. And yes, I agree. If I scroll down, beep, 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 you'll see these tools. You'll see mesh width, repeated density, and 2. 1 basically just makes a line of points. 2 makes just one set of triangles around the path that you did, and 3 creates that kind of line in the middle with triangles around it, like we were doing on the top lips. You're still like, this looks awful, and I still agree. So let's go ahead and reduce the repeated density. So that may be a little bit counterintuitive, but the repeated density is basically like, how soon do I put another point? So the smaller it is, the more points you'll have. So you can do that until you're happy. Like, I think that looks pretty good. And you're like, this is really far away from this line. That might create some weird gaps. You can go ahead and reduce that width, and boom, bam. And then you still see this ugliness. We're gonna go ahead and hit check. So that saves our progress. And I'm going to go ahead and remove some of these extra points that we don't need in the overlap here. And you're like, but now we have a gap. Well, we can go ahead and manually fill in that gap. You can also see that this line doesn't quite line up, so we can move the points that we think don't quite line up. You'll notice with mirror edit, moves don't reflect, so that's important to keep in mind. There we go. That's a little bit better there at the bottom. You can see because the mesh got too close to the line art, it just straight up cut the line art off. So important to keep in mind. You generally want to keep these points if you're going to be doing this method for like the lips. You want to keep these points about as a middle as possible, with these points as about, equidistant or equal like gap on either side as you can. That'll give you the best results. We're gonna go ahead and just pull these out so they match a little bit better. Push this one in. There we go. It's maybe not perfect, but it's pretty good. So we go ahead and you see these blue lines. We can go ahead and hit auto connect, add those so you don't have to add them manually. Push these so it's maybe a little bit more symmetrical, and go ahead and hit check again. And now we see that the art isn't cut off anymore. It looks a lot better. The other general way that people handle doing meshes, as you can kind of see here, is where that 2 shape comes from. So when you're doing mesh around like a shape, especially with color and line art, you'll want your triangles to kind of be around your shape. You'll want one dot, you'll want the dots on the inside connecting to dots on the outside. Usually you'll want them about equidistant, so let's go ahead and show you what that looks like. You can notice that it's lagging a little bit, and it's because this is probably overly detailed for what we want. So we have the same settings as before, but this one, we want it to actually spread out more. We want shape 2, and we want greater repeated density. We don't need that level of detailed for just a hair piece. Like, it doesn't need to be perfect in every way, shape, or form, because it is more of a flourish, if you will, when we move the hair. So we can see it's like, okay, maybe this line needs to line up with that a little bit more. We can double check the path, make sure everything's lining up the way that we want. And you'll see that it has these kind of triangles around the line art. And so we'll see that it cuts out the art in the middle. That's okay for now, because I'm just wanting to show you. This creates this nice kind of harmony with the line art and the color together. Makes sure they move together. So now let's go ahead and fill in the gaps, and it'll look pretty garbage. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit check, so then when I go back, I can see the parts that were cut off before. You could also go ahead and, if you wanted to start over just to see what, you can also always re-auto mesh it. That would be totally fine. I'm just going to fill in these points about in between each of these other points, unless I need a corner. It doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of get the vibe. And there you go. I'm also going to go ahead and put a dot here. I don't want to connect it to that point, so if you're like, oh, I have this one selected, I don't want it, you can hit escape. So now that we have our mesh, where do we go from here? So we could work with just the mesh. It would be a little bit complicated. It's a little bit unideal because the more overlapping things that you have, like if I move this over here, oops, I move this over, I move this over, and I want to move up, I move it to move down. It only moves up and down on the one left to right value that we added, because you have to specifically create every interaction of points, so like every overlap of points. So if you wanted to do everything on just the mesh, you start to have exponentially more points you have to do. So I generally recommend setting up deformers for most things and handle different movements on different deformers. What's a deformer? So the deformers are these little dooblies up here. So this is a warp deformer. It lets you warp the shape in bigger motions. And you can also create more detailed deformers. Less detailed deformers, we'll go over that more when I'm going to do an in-depth coverage of the UI. And we have rotation deformers, which let you rotate things. So usually what I do, and you can start wherever you want on a model. You can start with the eyes, you can start with the mouth. I usually start with the head angles. So for me, I'm going to go ahead for where I usually start. I grab everything that's attached to the head. Okay, so I start to see the bell stuff, so I'm going to grab the ear. And there you can see this looks kind of horrifying. That's all over mesh. I'm going to go ahead and create a rotation deformer. We're going to drag it down to the neck. And this will let the head tilt. And you see I missed some pieces, and that is okay. We can go ahead and grab the pieces that we missed and drag them on up into the rotation deformer. You can add or remove deformers at any time, so even if you aren't sure how you want something to move, you can still experiment, see what you like, get rid of it, whatever. So then if I wanted to, you know, have the whole glasses in a deformer, I could do that. I can just name it glasses, and bam. You'll see this little green box, and we have the glasses in it, and I can move the glasses as one whole big piece. You'll see it has this weird shape. If you don't like, this is because of the shape of the reflection. If you don't like that shape, you can hold Alt and bring it in closer until you like how it looks. That being said, if there is anything that's outside of the shape that you make, it will not get deformed properly. But for the reflection, that's totally fine. So I can see that it's not completely centered, so I can also hold Alt and scoot it until I'm happy with it. And then I can, you know, shift it how I want, and it'll be moving that mesh underneath. So if I check, there's the mesh before and after. So that's what the deformer's doing under the covers. So basically you make deformers for the things that you want to change, and then you start adding these parameter movements to them. So if I'm like, okay, when I look to the right, I move the glasses to the right. If I look to the left, I move the glasses to the left. Editing right here, I realized I forgot to tell you how to update a model for Live2D. So all you have to do is, in the same way that you originally import your PSD, you can, you know, file open or drag it in. You're gonna go ahead and file open, you're gonna pull in your updated Photoshop document, and then you should see a little pop-up, and then you'll see create new or the name of your current model. You're gonna select the name of your current model, and you're going to select replace. And then you're gonna hit OK, and it'll pull in all of the new updated textures. If there's anything that's new, it'll show up at the top, and you can put it wherever you need to put it. And I'll go over more of what all of the UI pieces are in another video. I'm going to be posting it at the same time as this one, so check that out after this one. Thank you for watching my video. Again, if you would like the Photoshop file that I used to make this model, you can check it out on my Ko-Fi for completely free. If you thought this was helpful, please leave a like and subscribe for more tutorials. If you have questions or think that I should make a tutorial on something else, please leave them in the comments. I will do my best to get to your questions. Anyway, I've been Ray. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye!